Right, so we should be letting everybody in. Hopefully you can see everything. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are excited to dig into today's topic that is becoming more and more critical across defense innovation and rapid acquisition, which is having to move from simply having a partner to building like a high impact team that can actually convey, right, in the OTA ecosystem. So OTAs reward speed and capability and execution, and the teams that understand how to collaborate effectively are the ones who are winning follow-on work and scaling their success. So today's conversation is going to be how to do that intentionally. But before we do jump right in, I want to give you a little bit of housekeeping guidance. So please go ahead and remove any potential distractions. So if you can, close the extra window, silence your cell phone, use headphones if that helps because you're in a co-working space. And as we do go through, make sure that you can use the Q&A if you have any questions. There's a Q&A box down at the bottom. We'll be saving some time at the end to address as many of those as we can. And you should also be able to use the webinar chat function if it's something where you just want to say like, hey, I can hear you. That's fine too. Would love that. And we are recording this session. It should have told you that when you popped on today. We are recording the session, and I will send the replay to anyone who has registered after it processes. So if you don't get that email within about 24 hours, the email will come from meg@govmates.com. If you don't have a copy after 24 hours, send me an email and I will get that to you ASAP. So today's panel is, as you can see here on the screen with us, we're joined by Chris from ATI, a senior program manager who brings deep experience supporting OTA programs and helping teams move, from prototype to production and so on. And then we also have Sai from PilieroMazza. He's a partner who advises clients on OTA strategy, teaming agreements, IP considerations, all of the things there and above, especially where things can get really complicated. So Chris and Sai, thank you for joining us. Chris, anything you want to add about what you do and how you help in the space?
Just to add, with my time at ATL, like Meg mentioned, I've had a lot of OTA experience. I'm currently, overseeing both AMTC, the Aviation Missile and Technology Consortium, and then DOTC, the Defense Ordnance Technology Consortium. So between those two OTAs, we have a vast, array of knowledge and executing those contracts. So happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Perfect. Thank you. And Sai, anything else that you would like to add? I know I probably didn't mention all the things that you do. So if there's more that you would like to share, I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah, no, I'm a government contracts lawyer. Been doing this over 20 years. Hit, every aspect of federal contracting, protests, claims, any sort of disputes, compliance issues, intellectual property protection. Do a lot of M&A structuring because we know there's a lot of that stuff dealing with compliance issues, and then we've helped create a number of smaller consortiums and individual like one-offs with whether it's OTAs or CRADAs or SBIR, STTR, if that ever gets turned back on, things of that nature. So happy to be here.
So deep experience in the space, which we appreciate, yes. And I am Meg O'Hara. I will be moderating today's discussion, and I'm the Director of Engagement at GovMates. So you'll be hearing a lot from me. Like I said, you'll get an email from me after that. And just a reminder, you're going to hear it a couple times. Just a reminder to use that Q&A box if you need it or have something that comes up within the discussion. All right, so the topics we're going to cover today, here's where we are headed. We're going to talk about best practices, of course, for identifying capability gaps and filling them effectively, how to negotiate teaming agreements and think about your IP when it comes to OTAs and teaming in the space. And then we'll walk through a real world case study of a successful OTA teaming strategy, which I'm excited to kind of get into because it's always nice to see the real world application of something that we chat about. And then we will wrap up with some Q&A, as we had mentioned earlier. So jumping directly in, why teaming actually matters. So at a high level, teaming matters in OTAs because the rules of the game are a little bit different. It's not to say that they are not transparent or that we aren't, putting out everything that we need to or whatever, but the rules are just a little bit different because of how they want us to act within it. So OTAs tend to favor capability over incumbency, right? It's not about who you are, but what it is that you can actually deliver in the space. So the government is also increasingly seeking some integrated solutions. At least that's what they're, telling us and what we would like to see happen. But they're not always looking for siloed vendors, right? Because if something goes down or if something doesn't work, we need to be able to have a team that can cover all of those capability gaps. So effective teaming tends to enable faster prototyping, broader technical coverage, which we said, as we have, we have multiple team members, we have a better chance to cover something that may be needed. And then a reduced risk in execution, which is something the government is constantly looking for. And all of those things evaluators tend to care deeply about when it comes to the OTA environment. So, Chris, first thing I want to ask you, how have you seen the approach to teaming in OTAs, especially recently, evolve over the last few years?
Yeah, so I think, obviously a great benefit to working with an OTA is the opportunity, as you kind of just alluded to, dynamic teaming. Unlike other acquisition vehicles, the OTA, it really gives the government a much more dynamic and inclusive approach, so they know, it's not going to be a kind of one thing fits all kind of approach there. At ATI, the consortia, the many consortia that we manage, we see this, firsthand. We see constantly different teams bringing on, non-traditional players like, startups, small businesses, and even, academia. This kind of gives you a nice, diverse kind of approach, a portfolio of individual teams that can kind of fulfill the needs of the government. And that also allows you kind of tackle those challenges, such as AI, cybersecurity, and advanced manufacturing from a kind of a different perspective than just having a a siloed team, one company team there. So another trend we've noticed is kind of the modular teams approach, where you have groups that can kind of scale and adapt as the project evolves over time. So what you start today may not be what you have at the end. So you have to have that ability to adapt to it as the project is evolving. Ultimately, it's really about being flexible and innovative, to meet the government's changing needs again, and that's kind of where the modular team kind of steps in there. You just have the ability to always be ready for what's next.
I do love the modular team approach because I feel like when a team like a program or a project progresses, you have different phases of it, and as that goes forward, you may have a different group that is a little bit better suited to execute on something. So love that as an option. What differentiates an OTA ready team from like a traditional capture team? Because I think we're used to, especially in the space, having our capture teams, right? Our color teams, all those sorts of things, and that nature. What's the difference?
I think it really boils down to speed and innovation. If, like you said, a traditional capture team may have a rigid process or, kind of a tiered structures that has to go through in order to get the answer out. Whereas an OTA team is going to be much more agile. They're going to, focus on solving problems quickly and, in a collaborative manner. So it's going to be, again, agility is probably one of the top keywords, flexibility. It's less about following, the playbook, more about kind of being adaptable and creative to get to the answer. There's not always a right answer for the problem.
Yeah, can I just add to a couple things I've also seen, the ones that we've worked on, is the government requesting people or companies that to join that have maybe a specific capability, because as the government's looking at, especially in the case of the prototyping phase, they're looking at different capabilities that they might want to add to something. And so they know of a potential vendor and they've been requesting that they get added to the team. And that's interesting because it makes you, like what we're talking about here, have to kind of pivot and add and figure it out, but also you're bringing a new player to an agreement. So from like the legal side, we negotiated an agreement with maybe 5, 6, 7, 10, who knows, right? However many players. And now you've got another player coming to the table and they might want to tweak things, and it has to go through whatever process is in the agreement, which could be pretty complicated. So just something to think about as you're developing the original agreements. It's probably a good idea to have a strong lead so you don't have to go mother may I to 15 people every time some tweak occurs. So just something to think about.
That is a very fair point. And so I kind of want to throw this one off the cuff to you a little bit because you might have a thought in this too. Um, you mentioned that government sponsors are often like, hey, add this person to the team. Is there a reason they're preferring teams over single vendor OTA solutions? Because it feels like from a paperwork perspective, it's easier to work with just one thing. Why is it that we're seeing now that they're like, hey, would rather have a team versus just one thing?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty common when you're dealing with more complicated situations or like things that are developing that have a lot of different components to it, or especially when there's different intellectual property that you bring to the table. there could be a number of different companies that have ownership or some sort of ability to add things to the table. And so that is going to take multiple different companies and multiple different sources, especially when it's something that is really unique or new, which is all about what OTAs are for, is for bringing like new and innovative things to the table rapidly. And so it really takes some of that extra support, extra help. So I think that's where it really stems from, which is not traditional. It comes from a different location.
That's right. Chris, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of touched on it, but I guess it also has the opportunity to reduce risk because those responsibilities are going to be distributed between amongst outside of one single company. So if one of those partners faces a challenge, you have others that kind of step in and kind of take on the workload or get it back on track, to some degree. And then of course, again, kind of touched on it, the diverse perspectives, more perspective, while it's not always the right answer, in this case, trying to get to especially a prototyping kind of outlook, is you want to have those perspectives that you may not otherwise have in a single company. So I guess just again having more, in this case, more cooks in the kitchen, has that ability to really, enhance the ultimate goal and the answer to the ultimate goal, which is the problem the government's trying to answer.
So it's more of like a many hands make light work versus, too many voices, trying to be heard. Because from a perspective of like, hey, the more people we add in here, the more voices we have, the more potential for conflict there is. But I think if everybody has their specific part that they do well, it kind of reduces that risk a little bit. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, yeah. As long as you're building your team in the right manner, and you're not just picking out team partners just to have a partner. That maybe could run a risk, but ideally, if you're having the right approach, bringing in the right people, the right teams, it should at least go along the way you want it to. It's not always going to work out, but that is the intent if you do it properly anyway.
Perfect. And that definitely is a lovely segue into our common teaming pitfalls, because this is where a lot of teams do tend to stumble. So it's possible for OTA teams to look good on paper, but then once the pressure, fills, they tend to collapse. So some of the common pitfalls include partnering too late in the process. So like, hey, and I know that sometimes these things are quick, right? They seem a little faster. You find out about something and all of a sudden you have to put something in. But partnering too late in the process, overlapping capabilities instead of complementary ones. So if you both do the same thing, something's going to be missing and you're going to have to figure out who does what where. And then any of the unclear IP ownership, that's going to be something that's going to run a huge risk of being an issue as well. We also see a lot of what we call logo teaming, which is a team that looks really good on paper, but they don't actually have a plan as to how to execute, right? It's kind of a handshake like, hey, we're going to work together on this, but there's no actual work that has gone in between, that discussion and the actual work to get started, where it says, hey, this is what each of us is going to do and what we're going to be responsible for. And then misaligned incentives and risk tolerance can definitely undermine even the strongest technical teams, meaning that like, hey, we had an agreement of what we were going to do, but either we didn't write it down or, it didn't align with both teams or whatever, that whoever's part of the team. And that causes a little bit more where now you've got somebody who cannot come through on what they were supposed to do. And now that's falling to another team or a different part of the team to cover that they didn't expect to do. So, Chris, how do you balance when you're creating your team? How do you balance speed with due diligence when it comes to a fast moving opportunity in the OTA space?
Yeah, and it is, again, you said it. It's a good segue, and it really, I think, hits what I was touching on before. Really hits it right here. Is you just have to have a clear criteria for evaluating who your partners are going to be. Their expertise, obviously, their past performance, and just cultural fit in general are three major ones, I'd say. Um, Now, if you've built a strong network of potential partners in advance, it's going to save you time when it comes down to actually deciding who needs to be on your team for that particular problem that you're trying to answer at that point. From ATI's perspective, at many of our collaboration events and membership meetings, be, we try to create a robust networking opportunity for the members to kind of start having those business to business one-on-one discussions, if they haven't already, to at least kind of begin deciding who could be a potential teaming partner for either a soon to be problem or maybe a problem that we don't even know exists yet. This again just gives the members the opportunity to be ready for those partnerships when they need them. That being said, while a lot of that does fall on obviously the industry side when they're creating those teams, I do say that I think the government, the requirement owner does play a role in this because, if a requirement owner is going to release a requirement without providing, ample opportunity for collaboration to the industry, that does run a risk to having industry required to kind of quickly form their teams, which, they may not or no teams at all, depending on the situation, and then they may not deliver the best possible solution for the government. So while it is obviously a huge, it's on the industry side, it's up to them to create those teams because they're the ones going to be performing. The government does have a kind of some obviously a say in it, but also a part in it, and assuring the teaming opportunities have the ability to succeed for the sake of the requirement.
Yeah, I feel like we're not trying to create these solutions just for fun. There is an actual stake in it where we want the answer. So it's helpful that there's a little bit of skin in the game for everybody. Sai, is there anything that you're seeing on your side where you're noticing like, hey, we are seeing this happen over and over again where these teams are not working out? Are there any pitfalls that you typically notice?
I think it's because the ones that I've been working on most recently, the government has their hand in it a lot. And it's in the middle, right? We're not talking about at the beginning or whenever something's going to get awarded. They might have gotten awarded. In fact, one I'm dealing with right now, the prototyping piece of it is over and it's in the production phase, and the government is insisting upon adding team members to things because of certain capabilities that they want to add to the product, which is arguably out of order because it's sort of because of the OTA thing is such a wild west, right? They're taking pieces of a prototype and sticking it into the production phase in a sense. And so because of that, and they're demanding certain new players come in, it's just kind of complicated, right? To renegotiate things and try to figure out what is going on. And again, this goes back to what I was saying before, because in this particular case I'm thinking of, they had it structured so that everyone had a say. And when everyone has a say in your team of like 5 or 6 or 8 players, and there's 1 or 2 new people coming to the table that might be very large and might want to throw their weight around, you get into a situation where they might have issues where other folks don't. And how do you negotiate that out? And sort of building the plane while you're flying it. And it makes it complicated, but that's the way the government in this particular instance is choosing to do it. So you don't really have a choice.
It sounds a little terrifying, honestly. I feel like it's doable and that you've got the right people in the right places. You can be successful in it, but flying and building at the same time is definitely an endeavor. All right, then that takes us into identifying our capability gaps. So one of the most important early steps is in creating teams is honestly identifying where your gaps as a business exist. So starting with some brutal honesty about what you cannot do alone. I think we're all very good, especially when it comes to like creating CAPE statements and giving our business pitch and having those business meetings. We're really good at talking about what we do well. It's sometimes what we don't do well that we kind of stick under the rug because we don't necessarily want to talk about it. But this is where we can, and this is a safe space to do that because you're going to find a partner who's going to be able to cover that for you. So a helpful framework for this sort of thing is build, buy, or partner. Can you build it? Can you purchase it? Or can you partner to cover it? Where do you truly have strength, and where do you actually find that you need support? So this includes technical capabilities, past performance, credibility. So you may have some past performance in a space, but it may not be strong enough, or it may not be a long enough time, or you may need just a little bit more to kind of cover that there. Manufacturing and scaling, security and compliance, as well as program management maturity. So these are some of the issues and the places where things tend to fall, or that we tend to not look at when we're looking at the things that we do really well. So if you have tools like win theme mapping, if you've done any of that, if you've got a gap to requirement, any of those matrices, if you create a matrix that has gaps and requirements and, the things you do and the things you don't, that tells you really easily where you're going to need to find new partners. And any of those, we love color team reviews, any of those red team reviews can kind of help make this process a little bit more objective. So it doesn't feel like where you're, missing something, but more where you can fill a gap there. And it also makes it a little bit more effective. So Chris, how would you suggest someone objectively assess their own organization's weaknesses without bias? Because it can be hard when we're looking at the things that we don't do. Nobody wants to look at what we can't do. We want to look at what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you touched on it, objective self-assessment is not going to, very rarely is going to be easy. I mean, it's tough to do. I mean, you hate to point out things you do wrong, of course, but the key I think is to combine internal and external perspectives. Internally, you have to. I think you need to create an environment where your people feel comfortable and kind of pointing out those gaps and flaws that you might have. So you're not unknowingly you don't unknowingly have these because nobody will actually say that they exist. So you assume everything is roses when in actuality there are some issues there that are not being addressed because your individuals don't feel comfortable pointing them out for whatever reason. And then externally, of course, having third party assessments, benchmarking your against industry standards and how you approach the your day to day is going to obviously provide you valuable insights. You of course may not always like what you get in those those assessments or those benchmarkings, but they could be vital to getting you on track to where you need to be successful. If there are reasons why you are not being successful, those may be exactly what you need to get put on the right track moving forward. And then other things with level setting, relying on data-driven, tools, performance metrics, SWOT analysis, just another couple of more opportunities to kind of look at objectively what it is, where you are, how you can improve, and how you're going to get to where you want to be.
And is this best done on like a case by case, like opportunity by opportunity, or is this something that you can do like, if you have an off season and you're like, hey, we're kind of looking to grow and expand and do those sorts of things, is this something you can look at ahead of time so that you already know that going in, seeing as though you're sure, or at least, have an idea of what you'd like to go after?
Yeah, I think it'd be really, I guess maybe both, but I think it's always in your best interest to kind of see where you are, especially if you're trying to maybe expand on what you currently do and want to, dabble in other areas. You may want to level set to see where you're at now, what you do well currently before you're taking that leap. So really, yeah, it can be done, quote unquote, in the off season or individual efforts. If you don't get the result that you want, that's obviously a time to reflect on that, but you more often maybe want to know the answer to why you may not succeed on something you're trying to seek out before you actually get there. So, doing it ahead of time would certainly be beneficial to the company, in my opinion.
Perfect. Are there any gaps that are often underestimated when it comes to OTA pursuits? Is there anything where people are like, oh, it should be fine, but really it's a bigger deal than we think?
Yeah, I think underestimating, just the agile project management, having estimating the importance of agile management, project management, and the ability to kind of integrate diverse technologies. Those are a couple that I think of. Communication is always key in everything. Communication across multi partner teams is something that can be overlooked. Again, kind of go back to the teaming. Teaming is great, but if you're not communicating well with that team, then obviously it could lead to, again, the results you're not looking for. You have to have alignment between technical solutions and operational needs. You don't if you're not solving ultimately the end user, the technology you have won't matter because if they're not getting what they actually want and you're not communicating, you're not putting everything your best package forward for the end user, then none of it's going to matter. So I think there's certainly things that are underestimated and just assumed are going to work fine without you actually putting into the work to understand that it may or may not work fine.
Assuming is not the way to go with this one. We actually
Exactly.
need to know, it seems. I did have a question that came in that says, how do you handle it when you see the government is adding complexity or partners in such a way that you think it might fail because of the changes that are being made? Is there anything that we can say like, hey, is there a way to go about that and be like, hi, concerns, without really causing a bump? And either of you are welcome to take that one on.
That's I can jump in. I'd say part of that is the trust that you may have built with that customer you're working, that government customer you're working with. So if you are communicating and you are you have established that working trusting relationship with that government partner, you may feel comfortable in kind of bringing that up and saying, hey, we understand what you're trying to do. We don't know necessarily if it's going to benefit. I mean, again, if you have to have that kind of relationship. If you don't have that kind of working relationship, then it may be a little tougher to kind of address it. But that's the key, is to kind of get the communication out there, because you don't want to continue forward if you have a very high feeling of high probability that it might fail. Maybe the customer hasn't thought of something that you do have in your mind, so you do need to put it out there for that customer to consider it, and maybe, oh yeah, you are right, that is something we should probably consider. Let me go back to the drawing board and see if something's better, or maybe not even use that approach at all anymore. So I think having that, again, trust, communication is vital to ensure that project itself will succeed, even if it's a tough conversation.
Sorry, anything you wanted to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, and from like the risk perspective, even though these are sort of non-FAR, non-regulatory agreements that you're entering into, and are kind of Wild West, the general overarching laws and policies of the working relationship between the federal government and a contractor still apply. So that from a risk perspective, if everything goes sideways, it's really on you. And so even if the government, quote unquote, made you do something, there's never such a thing. The government never makes you do anything. You choose to do it, right? And you can document it as best you can in case there is some sort of dispute or something that arises that you might need to, file a claim or take some sort of action under it. But the reality is that you need to raise these issues, unless if you're just going to sit on it and you take that risk, and that's just the reality of it. So you need to weigh that. And I would just to back up what Chris said, you need to really have that relationship, frankly, with these, because they are just sort of commercial relationships. So if you think about it from that perspective, if you're working with any customer or any company out there in the world and you don't communicate issues with them, that's going to put you at a major disadvantage if something goes sideways, and even more so vis-a-vis the federal government, because they're so protected as far as. And remember, if it's some lower level person or program manager or someone else of the government that's asking you to do something, they just have like apparent authority is what they call it. They don't have actual authority to bind the government, as opposed to like warranted contracting officers and those kind of people, that if you're dealing with them, they can't even bind the government. So there's zero liability from the government perspective if you're taking direction from lower level folks, or the government's giving you suggestions and you're taking them. So you just need to realize the risk that you're taking on and make that calculation from a commercial perspective.
And the reminder that everyone wants this to be successful. They're not just throwing it at spaghetti on a wall. They're probably just trying to think outside the box or whatever that might be. But at the same time, they might not have all the nuanced information they need to make more of a decision, or to see the full picture. So that's why having that communication that both Cy and Chris mentioned is probably best. So because at least you've said it, right? If you choose to have something to say and that you want to bring it up, like having that open line is something that you develop early on and keep through the entirety of the project, we hope. Finding the right partners for this one. I know I have a question in my Q&A that I'm going to get to that is actually on this slide, but finding the right partners, we've talked about just a little bit. It's once you know your gaps, the next question is where you actually get people to join with you in a team. If you are building this team, if it's not being created for you, or if the government hasn't come and said like, hey, I want these people together, there are opportunities for you to build your own teams. But strong places to look include your OTA consortium member list. So being involved with your consortium is important. Attend the member meetings, go to the industry days. Like if you have the opportunity, get there so you can get in the room with people and have those talks, because you don't know what they know, what they've been working on, or where they have capability gaps that you might be able to fill. Prototype performers that have follow-on potential, having conversations with those. Non-traditional vendors and startups are an option. The academia side is also something that you could look at, or FFRDCs, which for those who don't necessarily have all of their alphabets straight right now, federally funded research and development centers. And then, or as Sai had mentioned earlier, the SIVR or STTR awardees as well, depending on where that goes from here. Or we'll say past SBIR or STTR awardees, seeing as though where we are currently. Beyond capability, you're also looking for partners who have proven OTA execution, great cultural compatibility, and the ability to move quickly and make those decisions. That agility seems to be a theme here. So if you're, making sure you're drinking water as we're taking this, every time we say agility, have another sip. From a teaming perspective, somebody had asked, does the team need to be finalized upon initial submission? Or is it more of a recommendation to say something like, we'll be looking for partners in XYZ during the award process as we get towards those phases? So do we have to come with a team already created, or are we able to kind of like build it as we learn more?
In our experience, both. I mean, you want to have maybe a little, at least some sort of direction of who's going to be involved. It doesn't have to be, that is not the finite answer where, what you put on paper today and a potential response has to be the team that's, ultimately executes the effort, because those are ever changing. But you maybe have like at least a decent idea of who you want to start discussing with, talking with, and ultimately teaming with. But to answer the question, no, you don't have to know today for an execution for the next 3 to so years. I mean, that could change, but you will want some sort of idea of who you're going to go in with to help ultimately answer the requirement that the government has put out there, because that's part of your response and the consideration from the government into choosing you to move forward with. So I guess yes and no is maybe a vague answer there, a vague way of saying it.
My favorite way to get an answer, but that tends to be kind of where it is here. Like we hate an it depends answer, but we also understand that this space, especially, it does definitely depend on the special circumstances that you're presented.
Mhm.
Yeah, and are you the one that have like the special sauce or whatever, right? I mean, is it your intellectual property? Is there some sort of key aspect to this that you are driving, or is it more just a general requirement that the government's putting out there and you might be working with a larger consortium as opposed to some of the ones I've been dealing with, which the government, it's like a direct relationship with one of the lead member, kind of not through a consortium, creating their own, and going from that perspective, which I'm seeing more of. But is that what you're doing? In which case, then you might not need as big of a team. But at the same time, if you haven't thought about where your gaps are or what the government really needs, and whether or not your secret sauce just answers the mail on every aspect of it, that's going to telegraph to the government that you are not prepared, and you are not the appropriate vendor to get this done if you haven't thought through all of the various issues. So I would say that could be a red flag if you don't know what gaps you have, or you haven't done that analysis. That just shows maybe you're not ready, especially in the open world that this is. It's not where the government's bringing some sort of requirement to you with everything written down and all the different FAR clauses and everything. It's a collaborative effort, and you need to be prepared for that and sell yourself.
It's all about being, available and knowing what you need and what you can do, which we love. So, somebody had asked, and I don't know if this is an answer that we don't have today, happy to get it and to send it to this person, but it says, when you've identified an FFRDC as a potential partner, are there special requirements for getting them on the team and funded? Do either of us know that offhand? I don't know the answer to that
Yeah,
one. So I didn't
I
know if there's
don't.
something special that you have to do, or if it's just like, hey, we're part of the team.
I have not dealt with an FFRDC in one of these. I've dealt with academia, and I will tell you, you need to be forewarned that institutions of higher learning are extremely aggressive when it comes to negotiation, especially with intellectual property and ownership rights and what they can and can't do, which can be extremely problematic from both the government perspective and your perspective. So just be aware of that, and be aware of some of the special rules that can come up with the non-commercial entities, because they might have their own view of the world that doesn't directly align with what you're looking to do from a commercial perspective.
Perfect. Chris, anything on that one? I know that was kind of a
No,
wild card.
yeah, yeah. No, I think I agree with Sai. I mean, it's not a lot to add there, but certainly can provide a future answer.
Yeah. Definitely. Awesome. So once we've kind of figured out all the things that we need, now we need to vet teaming partners, right? It's not just because you're buddies and because you know each other, but we need to kind of figure out how you're going to work together. So vetting is where teams either set themselves up for success or definitely future headaches. So key criteria for vetting potential team members is including the OTA or rapid acquisition experience. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Financial stability. I know we don't like talking money all the time, but we're going to have to make sure that we're all in the right standing to be able to do and to execute on what we need. Security posture. So do they have CMMC? We've had new CMMC stuff drop. It continues to drop. This is a real thing. It's not just an idea anymore. So where are they? What are their facility clearances and do they need them? And how, like, are they coming up for, you know, are they going to be able to stay without, like, throughout the program or whatever that is? Also, willingness to share risk. Are they in there to team with you and equally or appropriately share risk? Or are they like, hey, we'll give you this stuff, but we're not taking on any of, the risk there. And then a clear value add beyond just the name recognition, right? We're not, logo. We're not logo teaming. We need to actually make sure that everybody is going to behave appropriately and pull their part of the weight. So best practices here, conduct a pre-teaming due diligence review. So kind of like you did for your own team, or you bring in a third party or whatever that is, do that for the actual vetting of the team members, not just exchanging capability briefs. Yes, it's great to know what they do, but get a little bit more into the weeds. Take the time to make sure that this is going to go down in the right way for you guys. Somebody did ask, what recommendations do we have for a small business that wants to join an established team but doesn't know how to present their capabilities to attract the attention of larger primes? Is there any sort of recommendation there that we can say, hey, this is the best way to kind of go about that other than being part of a consortium already? Chris, do you have anything on that one?
Well, outside of being a part of consortia already, I think even if you're not a part of, officially part of the consortia, at least for an ATI consortia, we do offer other opportunities to kind of get your name out there. Not all of our events, are locked in. So if it's a distro A event for instance, while it is it is geared towards the members. There are times where we've had non-members, allowed to come there as a distro age, kind of get a little kind of feel for what's there, and then maybe this is something I want to be a part of, and I can be a part of, and then it gives you the opportunity to then start having those conversations with other members that you may be able to team with. We've had a lot of one-on-ones over the years that you just see a small business, so maybe one person small business that's representing the company there, and they're just trying to talk to as many people as they can to get their name out there and try to say, here's what we do, here's how we do it, and here's why we think we could benefit you. So while they are historically have been a part of our memberships, you can do that, be a membership at a low barrier to entry, and then also be able to use that as your ability to get onto the teaming, have a teaming opportunity. And that's what we've seen many members have great success, from a small business standpoint, is just trying to do everything they can at those events to talk to everybody they know, or that they meet, and just get and in somewhere. And then once you kind of do that, maybe it starts building into more and more down the road, and then you never know, what that could lead to. So I think if you're not already a part of one in the consortium, it's certainly something to look into for just the sake of having that ability to talk to thousands of different companies throughout the space that can maybe help you, or need you in future opportunities.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'll say most of these still the government will talk to the consortia that are out there, especially the larger projects and the larger consortia. The government will reach out to them and say, this is what I need, and essentially contract with the consortia, which then sort of quote unquote subcontracts, we'll call it, to the various members. So from that perspective, I know when people are asking questions or like, how do I get in or what do I do? That it is, unless you've got some sort of really special item that you're pitching and the government is really willing to work with you and you personally to go through a specific OTA that's just for your group that you're setting up. The vast majority of these things go through some of the larger consortium. And so that is really the place to start and to go through and meet some of the folks that are out there, because the chances of you pushing something that's just a kind of run of the mill, and you got to be honest with yourself about that. If it's not some sort of really unique thing that you've got, very unique intellectual property that you already have developed, then pitching that to the government is going to be very difficult, especially if the government is paid for development of something and they already have certain rights in it, and trying to get them to pitch it to move to an OTA or to something like that, that can also be extremely difficult to do because the impetus isn't necessarily there, and the government gets a lot more protection and a lot more capability to develop in the future if it goes through more of a FAR process, especially if they've already paid for development.
Awesome. And I do know that we've had a couple of questions come in, and we've mentioned a few times about the different OTA consortia. Somebody asked, where can I get a list of all of these? I've just put a link in the chat. Hopefully everybody can see that. If you scroll to the bottom, that'll give you a list of all of the consortia. I think they're broken out by vertical, which is great. I do want to move on because this is also super important to structuring some of these teaming agreements. This is where we get into the legal side of things. So teaming agreements need to be practical, not just protected. We want them to be protected, but they also need to be something that people can actually follow. So Sai, how much formality is enough in an OTA teaming agreement?
So yeah, you definitely need to be flexible, right? When you're adding and like removing people, like we were talking about, or different capabilities that your people are bringing to the table, because it is a very commercial type agreement. At the same time, I think like sort of what I said earlier is that what you need to be the clearest about in any of these agreements is who's controlling what aspects of things. The more people who have control over something, or if you're structuring it in a way where there's like a board of managers or something to that effect, which I've seen a lot of, it creates issues. Like up front, it's a way to get started because then everyone feels like, oh, well, we don't have to negotiate as hard today. Let's just get this moving. So everyone has a vote. We'll do this. But then later, you get into performance time where things really matter at that point. Because if you can't get things moving quickly, you already have an agreement and you will fail and you will be held accountable, as opposed to not getting the OTA, which stinks, right? You don't get it, but not getting a job is far better than getting a job, failing, and then being held accountable financially and otherwise because of that failure. So it's better to give away an opportunity than to take something you're not prepared for and fail. So you need to think about it from that perspective. And when you're putting the agreements together, you need to slow down a little bit and try to negotiate the control aspect if you're taking the lead on this. And this is also where some of the larger consortia can be helpful, because they can support you in that effort, right? Sometimes they will say like, this is the lead party, and then everyone else is sort of under that person. So it's like a subcontractor and lower tier subcontractor, as opposed to some of the ones that I've been working on that are more direct, we'll call it direct awards, where there is no overarching consortium, you're sort of creating it. And in that perspective, people are just so excited to get going that they negotiate these agreements where everybody's got a vote, and then things are changing or there's questions that are coming up and nobody wanted to think about it. We just wanted to get in there. And that's where you're sort of building the plane while you're flying. And there's been then more issues can arise. So I would say that is the most important thing, is clarity on control and who's really the individual who's going to make the final judgment call.
That's fair. And I think that actually answers my second question, which was, are there structures that help prevent disputes during execution? So it sounds like having somebody in the lead and making sure that like you think these things through in advance is going to be what actually keeps you from having disputes when it comes down time to like get work done. Correct?
For sure. Yeah. Unless you've got like very clear verticals where people are having different control over different aspects. But at the end of the day, like adding, removing members and executing like work share, moving things around depending on how the government wants things done. Like you really, it's good to have somebody in control.
Yeah, but that way you can look to somebody, right? So we're all not, again, too many voices is not always great. So some of the critical elements for structuring these teaming agreements include clearly defined roles and responsibilities. We talked a little bit over that. Work share, revenue splits, governance and decision rights, which so I definitely just touched on exit clauses, which are again things that we probably don't necessarily want to think about, but they do happen. And then any dispute resolution mechanisms, which again, if you talked it out in the beginning, then when something does occur, then you have a way to kind of follow through without having to stop the project or cause unintended issues. And then for OTAs specifically, it is important to balance flexibility with enforceability, right? So understanding the consortium rules and planning early for transition from prototype to follow-on production, which is something that happens more often here than in other places.
Yeah, and when you're talking about disputes, remember you need to deal with disputes between members and disputes vis-a-vis the government itself, because they're two completely different things. And you should have different sections governing that, because you could have a situation where certain members have a dispute against the government, maybe the lead doesn't, and there can be conflicting interests there. And to the extent that you haven't dealt with it ahead of time, then it can be difficult to do on the fly.
Exactly. IP, as we have seen, can be one of the most common and most damaging sources of conflict if it's not addressed early, which is why Sai had made that big point earlier that I hope that you listened to. But I do have a question about, because I kind of touched on it earlier when we talked about prototype moving to production, right? How do you handle IP when a prototype may transition to a FAR-based production contract? Is that different, or can you kind of just merge them together?
So if you've done it the right way at the beginning, then and you've negotiated the OTA in a commercial manner, then there should be some sort of license that is already negotiated out there, and it can be treated as commercial intellectual property, which depending on let's say it's a DoD or DOW issue, right? And you're looking at the DFARS. If you're looking at that perspective, you have sort of commercial intellectual property, it's subject to a license agreement, right? So you would want to make sure that the license agreement is more fully defined and written down, executed, becomes part of the contract, because it shouldn't be subject to any of the FAR DFARS provisions for non-commercial intellectual property, because they're very restrictive and you have to be extremely careful. There are particular legends in the FAR and the DFARS that you have to deal with, and it has to be exact if it's non-commercial, but it shouldn't be. If you've developed under an OTA, it should be commercial. It should be governed by a license agreement. Again, not to harp on that, but that's the way it should be done. And so you should have license agreements in effect that are going to be attached, as opposed to dealing with the non-commercial FAR clauses that are problematic if not taken very seriously.
Perfect. How do you balance protecting IP with the government's need for access and for being able to reuse it, knowing that you might have a license agreement, but is there something else that you can do to balance that and protect that?
Yeah, that's always really tough because
We ask hard questions here.
yeah, the government for years and years and years, the government has said we want to buy things commercially. We want, commercial intellectual property. It's faster, it's better. And then they realize like what that means, right? You don't own any real rights in anything unless you're paying for it, right? You get like a subscription to Office 365. You don't have any rights to do anything. The second you stop paying Microsoft, you're out of luck, right? And you can't ask, I don't know, WordPerfect to start developing new modules or components to Word or Office, right? It's a different company. So only one company has the intellectual property rights to something in the commercial context. And so it's something where the government needs to have a better understanding of that. At the same time, if the government needs something like government purpose rights, because just because it's an OTA doesn't mean they can't use FAR terminology or FAR clauses or a lot of other things, right? And it's shorthand. So the government does do that fairly often. But at the same time, you want to push back on that a bit, because if you don't, if your main customer is the government and you say, okay, well, we're not going to give you unlimited rights, we'll give you government purpose rights, If your customer is the government, there's no difference. The government can take intellectual property, and if they have government purpose rights, they can give it to a third party to further develop or to manufacture it or to add new components to it or to do further follow-up prototyping to it. They can do anything they want as long as it's a government purpose. So there's really no difference there, and I think people don't have that understanding, and so it can be very uncomfortable. But if your customer is the federal government, you need to be prepared to push back. If otherwise, sure, you're getting funding in order to develop this, but at the end of the day, if you can't resell it, then what are you really getting? You're just I mean, I guess you're helping the populace, so that makes you feel better. But if you're a commercial entity and you're trying to make money off of all of this, you need to be sure that you're developing things and you're holding on to that, which is also why anything that you're bringing to the table, you need to make sure that you're clearly identifying that up front and protecting it. And in the context of an OTA, that means having some sort of license and delineating up front as much as you can about what sort of we'll call background, like here on the slide, like background intellectual property you're bringing to the table. What are the other folks bringing to the table? And putting as clear a box around that as humanly possible, because any sort of lack of clarity there is going to invite further disputes down the road, either between members or between members and the government itself, if there's a misunderstanding or they feel like there's been some sort of co-development. And the last thing I'll just want to add, especially with co-development, is that if the general rule for intellectual property, not just in this context, but generally, is that if you've co-developed something, then everyone has a sort of joint and several rights in it and ownership of it, which means people can do, the person who developed it, if three people develop something or three companies develop something, any one of them can do anything they want, including giving it away for free, or like if it's source code or something, putting it on the internet for everyone to see, and that's perfectly fine. So even in the context of co-development, you still want to have cross licensing agreements, not to give rights, but to restrict the rights and ability of different entities to use it, so that they're not doing that. They're not eviscerating the value of it.
Oh, that makes sense. And it's one of those things we talked early on, best practice wise, have these conversations early, right? Like you should be doing this well before, so that even before you come to a team, you know which portions you're bringing and how you're protecting them. That should be done probably well in advance of you actually joining a team and bringing that anywhere, just because that way you know what's yours and how it's going to be used later on. Some of the other best practices, like we said, avoid, any of those scenarios where somebody could take it or sell it or give it away or put it on the internet for free, which we do not like. And then making sure you're aligning whatever strategy you're using with some of the long-term commercialization goals. So something that may work for this team right here, right now, if something goes on to production phases or something else, that could change the way that it's used. So take a look at full picture, not just what works for everybody at this moment. It's more of a long-term discussion or long-term plan than just a, hey, let's get this on paper so that we can move forward with, whatever the technical phases are. Couple things for collaboration during execution. Execution is where strong teams separate themselves from those who are not as strong, because high impact teams tend to use shared program dashboards and construct like internal technical reviews, and they are using, like, if you've got one person who's in charge or one entity that's in charge and they're kind of leading the thing, that's the voice that's being used. It's not a whole bunch of different voices coming out at the same time. And then they also have a clear escalation path for any issue. So all of these things are well defined in advance of any of these things happening. So the key takeaway there is that trust is built through delivery, not through just the agreement. So the agreements are great to have. We know that we need them. They're going to protect us in different ways, but also the delivery itself is going to be part of what takes that through as well from the collaboration piece. So Chris, question for you. How do successful teams tend to maintain alignment once the award is won? Because the only part of the work is winning the award. Now we have to actually execute on it. How do we maintain alignment between all of the team members?
Probably, I hate to sound like a broken record, but really, regular communication is very, very key, obviously. That's in many aspects of our life, of course, but successful teams are also going to establish, clear roles and responsibilities, so they know kind of who is responsible for what, who needs to be held accountable for what. Even having like a, maybe a formal governance structure for that particular award, that project, maybe like a project management office. So maybe individuals from each of the the partners are kind of overseeing it, and that kind of maybe can help keep everybody on track, and again, accountable. This sounds obvious, but performance metrics, regular progress reviews, those are going to be very key to obviously knowing where you are in a particular effort, so that where you're maybe lacking, you're behind, or maybe you're ahead. Everybody's going to know how you stand from the project's objectives that you set forth at the beginning of the effort itself. So again, simplistically speaking, communication, you want to make sure you're the same way you created that team, in the manner you created it, knowing communication is key, trustworthiness, all the key attributes of a good team. Those don't end when the actual execution of the project is going on. It maybe you'll even enhances it, because obviously now you're in the real thick of things, of having to execute the project, the effort, the answer that you promised you would provide, to the government. So now you're in the thick of that. You need to ensure that everybody on that team is aligned. Everybody knows where the finish line is, where we are now, and how we're going to get there. So again, communication, ensuring everybody knows what they should be doing, how they should be doing it, and when they need to do it by. Having some kind of governance above the team to ensure there are gatekeepers to know that things are getting done for sure. And then just again, knowing where your metrics and where you are from a review standpoint, always keeping that at the forefront to know, again, where you are and where you need to go to get to the end goal.
Perfect. And that actually leads right into the next slide that we have that talks about operational discipline. Just to reiterate what Chris said, communication, when teams communicate really clearly, it resolves issues quickly, they stay aligned internally, and the government ends up noticing, right? And so because of that, it translates into like directly into follow-on opportunities, or the opportunity is there for that to be a little bit easier of a pull. I did want to jump quickly because we only have a couple more minutes left, but at this point we kind of want to ground the discussion in some real world examples. And so Chris, I would love for you to walk us through the case study where we kind of saw teaming well done and what worked, and if we saw any challenges, and what ultimately made the team successful in the OTA environment.
Yeah, sure. So, so this is a real life example, ongoing example. It was with DevCom AVMIC. Ultimately, the problem that I guess technical gap that was trying to be answered by the government was the blade manufacturing process, on Army aviation platforms. As you can see on the screen, those are the gaps that were trying to be answered, or trying to be filled, I should say. High cost and long lead times, labor intensive processes, design constraints, underutilization of advanced materials, and then inconsistent quality and yield. So again, this is what the government laid out for the consortium members to kind of answer, and it was done in a teaming arrangement, as stated there. So what we did was, as we normally do, we offer it all to the entire OTA in this case, and of course anybody within that is a member of that consortia has the opportunity to submit an answer. A lot of the times it's not necessarily those small businesses, as we kind of touched on earlier, those non-traditionals or small businesses that are trying to answer the full solution. They're trying to really provide an aspect of the solution that they can team up with a quote unquote prime to provide their portion of it. So because that's what their expertise is. They may not be able to build the entire prototype, or fill the entire requirement, but they certainly have the expertise to provide an aspect of it to get them involved in the effort, which is of course what the OTA is meant to do, is to get those non-traditionals, those small businesses involved. So in this case, there was a traditional contractor that is serving as the quote unquote prime, with several of the non-traditional partners, small businesses underneath. And in this case, the almost 50% of the effort is actually being done by the non-traditional partner. So while the OTA stipulates that you of course have to have the non-traditional participation, there's not necessarily a direct line of how much that participation is. But in this case, it's nearly 50%. So obviously a success for a teaming arrangement under the OTA because it's showing that the non-traditionals are truly involved. So the prime, the traditional, is really the provided that oversight. They may they have maybe more of the experience in the field of contracting in general. So they're maybe they're providing that oversight for the effort itself, where those non-traditional partners, kind of as alluded to, are providing the kind of unique aspects to the project to get the ultimate answer to the government that was requested in the requirement. So that's how the arrangement was created. Again, we kind of touch on the modular workspace and why it works in this case. It's again, the prime contractor is overseeing, it's focusing on the program while they're as the program is moving along, the teaming of the prime and the non-traditionals are able to adapt to what's going on currently. As one of the things under the OTA is the flexibility. So things may change as the project is evolving, and the OTA, while having that teaming arrangement, has the ability to kind of flex, and it's agile to pivot to maybe a new challenge that has arisen from that may not have been at least forecast at the beginning, and that modular work share kind of allows them to do that seamlessly in most cases. Again, when you have a good teaming arrangement, you're going to know the ownership of deliverables, so everybody knows exactly what they're required to do for the team. And again, if there are some kind of gaps there, you have that communication to ensure that if somebody's falling behind, that you have the kind of the comfort, you're comfortable enough to bring it up to the rest of the team members as to, hey, here's where we stand, and then there's a kind of discussion of how to get back on track. So, but knowing where what you're required to do certainly helps the project move along, because nobody's kind of guessing who's doing what. And then, of course, discipline, just the regular reviews, kind of what I touched on a few minutes ago, just having those constant discussions, those reviews, understanding where you are, what you've done well, what still needs to be accomplished in the period of performance, and just ensuring everybody on the team's aligned to make sure it's moving forward as promised. So again, this is an ongoing project that is currently succeeding. I mean, obviously, we don't know the answer to the ultimate we don't know the ultimate answer yet, because it's still ongoing. But from our perspective, the way it was started to where it's been was awarded to now operating, it's successful in that regard. Again, TBD on what the ultimate prototype success is in the end, but it's a kind of I think a good picture of how the OTA can work for non-traditionals, and that teaming arrangement where you have the primes, not the typical primes, traditional contractors, and then the non-traditionals working together, coming together and creating a solution for a complex requirement with the opportunity to still be flexible, and knowing things may change along the way, and having that ability, that agility to change as needed.
Perfect. Thank you. And like you said, it's an ongoing thing. So the final solution's not fully there yet, but it's clearly working the way it's supposed to. And so that's kind of what we want to see there. And knowing that a lot of these things are ongoing projects anyways. I did have a quick question. It says, where can we get an OTA consortium member list? If you are part of that consortium, especially if you're part of the an ATI consortium, they have an app called Collaboration, and you can actually get onto that app into your consortia and see the different members that are on there. So that's a really handy little thing. So usually you have access to those lists, or who's kind of in those depending on which consortium you join. There's no place that's just like, here are all the things. We would love that, but that does not exist right now. And then another question said, there are many OTA consortiums. How do you determine which one to join, as an investment can be costly if you look at multiple depending on agency focus? So I would say, from the perspective that I've seen for small businesses, look at the ones that have, you can kind of get onto any of the, especially on the ATI website, there's a person behind every email there. So if there's one that you're interested in looking at, email them and ask them, be like, hey, can I jump on a phone call? Here are the things that we're working on. They're going to be able to tell you, if that aligns with what they're doing and the work and the places that they're going. Chris, do you have anything else to add to that one?
No, I guess slightly, just if, as Meg said, there is a person on that email, and we're always happy to jump on a call. And if it's, just because you call about a specific consortium does not mean we're going to, if it doesn't align, we're going to say, sorry, it just doesn't work. We're going to potentially kind of transition you to a different person has the expertise in another consortia that we think might be have a better alignment. So, we often field phone calls or emails from similar, industry members in that kind of that boat of which one do I join? And the conversation just, what do you do well? Here's what we think. Here's where we think you might, best align, and then ultimately you can make that decision for your company. But yeah, I mean, we are more than happy to jump on a call, email, just kind of give you what we think might work best for you, and then you ultimately you make that decision that in the end. But always happy to discuss it.
Perfect. And then I did want to ask each of you, Sai, what do you, if you had to give one piece of advice to a first-time OTA team builder, what would it be?
Yeah, what would it be like the best advice? I would say make sure that you have a clear understanding of what you are trying to get out of this and what your goals are and whether or not it directly aligns with what the government needs, including some of the IP issues and things of that nature. Like, because if you don't know what your end goal is after this is done, then you're not going to understand how to structure it correctly. And there's a high chance things will go sideways at some point.
That's great advice. And then, Chris, for you, what should organizations start doing now to be better teaming partners on future OTAs?
You know, I guess kind of taking a look back at what you've done in the past, whether it's with OTAs or not, if you're new to the game, kind of understanding or even other, having looking at other OTAs, if you're thinking about joining, is kind of seeing what projects are out there. Maybe try to find some members that are part of those different consortia, to kind of get a lay of the land. If you or call ATI as well, that's an opportunity. But kind of understand what you do well now, understand what the kind of each of these OTAs are looking for in terms of projects that have been maybe awarded in the past that not all of them will be awarded again, but a lot of times we see kind of similar type of requirements that come about in the future after one's already been executed. So kind of get an idea of what the government may be seeking under these different OTAs, and then just kind of assessing assessing, like we said, or self-assessment to kind of understand what you have to offer to the member, so that when you get in front of a prospective teaming member, you already know what you're going to tell them and how you're going to tell your story, and that way, whether it's for a particular requirement now or maybe one for the future, they're going to remember what it is that you do well, and they're going to call you when it's time. And that's the whole discussion we had earlier about doing things ahead of time, so that when it does come about, the team is already kind of ready to go, or at least have a good sense of who will be in that team, and it's not a guessing game as to who will be involved, because everybody's already knows who's who and is ready to execute when the time calls.
Perfect. I know that we are over time. I just want to say thank you to everybody for being here. I have a couple of questions, and I will follow up with those people afterwards to make sure that all of those get answered. So not a problem there. To wrap it up, big takeaways here. Team early, not reactively. Fill gaps intentionally, not politically. Treat IP as a strategy, not as a footnote. You need to get that in there and know what you're doing ahead of time. And remember that execution discipline is what often wins follow on. So the final thought to leave you with is this. In OTAs, the team is often the differentiator. So thank you to everybody for being here today. Thank you to Chris. Thank you to Sai. And we look forward to seeing you on a future one. So have a great rest of your week, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you.